As you can see, we have one less person here today. Unfortunately, because of the weather, Jen Cheatham was supposed to be coming from Boston and got stuck on a plane last night, and we were texting all day. And Rachel, who's here from Tennessee, actually missed her flight, but was able to kind of catch the other one. But Jen was not able to make it last night, so she did give us a video. So she will have a little video presentation, but she won't be here to interact with us. I also just want to thank Jeannie Myung over here, and who put really this together, and so I want to give us a round of applause for Jeannie. Jeannie did all the legwork and helped conceptualize this, so I don't want to take the credit. So the topic here is something that I'm sure none of us, all of you are aware of, right? We know the challenges that we're facing from that very sobering introductory panel that we just had. And just to go a little further, right, we know the number of superintendents are leaving their job is increasing, and I'm not going to steal the thunder of Rachel and her amazing work, but we are, getting less experienced folks in. We're having a real hard time filling some of these positions. We know many districts, including our nearby Sac City, have interims, and it's not unique to California, but it's a significant issue. And we knew it was a difficult job before the pandemic, and we know it's even more so, as the panelists said so much better than I can right now. But we're witnessing the politicization of schooling, as Carl's been speaking about, the threats to safety for these individuals, the divided communities that people are facing in these positions. And I think that we're also seeing, because of the high demand, we're seeing salaries and benefits increasing, and that's obviously posing a problem financially, given the financial picture that we were just told about. So that's creating also just tremendous instability in our school systems. And so in a time when schools are already struggling from all the issues that we heard about, this is a significant issue when we think about leadership. So that's what this panel was conceptualized around, and we wanted to move to the next step to think about sort of not just what is the problem, but what can we do about it. So we have an amazing panel here today. Carl Cohn, who you, I guess, already were introduced to, so I won't really go into it again, just to say that he brings us leadership experience at so many levels. When you think about the work he was at a state board level as the first director of the CCEE, and then as his work as superintendent. And I forgot about that little stint you did at USC. So that's nice. There's a connection there. But he's also, really thought hard about these issues. He's a prolific writer about these issues, and also a dedicated mentor to many superintendents around the country during this very difficult time. So we're really lucky to have him here. Jennifer Cheatham, who is not here, I want to just give an introduction to. She's a senior lecturer and faculty co-chair of PELP, which is the Public Education Leadership Project, and also the Education Leadership Organizations and Entrepreneurship Program at Harvard. And that program, the PELP program, as many of you know, is really a model for the country. They partner with district teams in working on sort of leadership issues. She's also co-leading something with Carl that I'm a part of called the Collaborative on the Politics of the Superintendency, where they're bringing together scholars, superintendents, and folks who are supporting leaders across the country and doing some really exciting work. And she too has experience having been a superintendent in the central office and in many other ways, and also had connections to California. So I think she really wanted to come get out of the cold and be here, and that didn't happen. Okay, and then Rachel Wright is assistant professor of educational leadership and policy studies at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Did her work, also she was started at Old Dominion, and she did a postdoc at USC, the connection I keep making. She was a former school board member, and I think what's most exciting about having her here is that she's doing this incredible work tracking superintendents around the country. So she put together the first of its kind national longitudinal database on superintendents. And so I don't know if any of you have seen some of the work lately, but she's tracking turnover and she's tracking gender gap. And she went district by district and hand collected the data about who's at the superintendent and how long they've been there. So she's going to share some incredible data with us. So that's the overview. I wanted to just briefly share, this is our objectives here, to kind of gain a better understanding of the challenges facing district leaders, learn about some promising approaches to bring coherence and approaches to kind of navigating through these challenges, and identify some practices to support district leaders to succeed.
When I was appointed superintendent of schools in 1992 in Long Beach, during the middle of the Rodney King riots, everything was local. all of the issues that I dealt with had to do with real things that were happening in Long Beach, California. I asked one of the school board members, and when I'm working with superintendents today, I ask them to do this. Sit down with each board member and ask them why they selected you. I did that with my board members, and one of the board members from North Long Beach said, I selected you because you were the only school person who had the courage to wade into that crowd of youngsters who had burned down the DMV. And you kind of go, you know, when you get appointed superintendent, you're like, I'm an extraordinary instructional leader, I'm all this sort of thing, and you waded into that crowd using your skills as a high school counselor to actually listen to young people who were really angry. And that really was the difference. Now, I would argue at the same time, this business of flipping the switch, if you go back to that same time frame, Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition actually said, I would rather have 1,000 school board members than one president and no school board members. So what's coming now is sort of the realization of a plan that in some quarters has been in place for a long time. My second bullet on church-state separation, when I go to these school board meetings where a specific individual evangelical church is now in control of the school board, one of the things that they constantly reference is that principle of democracy is wholly made up by the mainstream media. And it's an extraordinary indictment of civics education in America. And last year I was on an AERA panel about the revitalization of civics education. But this powerful belief that that's recent and it's made up by the mainstream media to keep Christian values out of public schools. The best things about what I'm tracking with regard to these specific churches, they are not trying to hide anything that they're doing. Every Monday morning, I get an email from the pastor of the 412 church that is fully in charge of Temecula. Dear Carl Cohn, don't know if you were at our services yesterday, but if you weren't, here's what you missed. And it's all there with regard to what they believe, that this is a just cause, a holy purpose, that they are saving America by taking over a local public school system. And so, as I think about the work of superintendents, we have to develop new allies, new coalitions. I just flew in from the AXA Superintendent's Symposium, which is going on in Indian Wells. And I was chatting with a superintendent just last night, and she was all wound up about unions. We gotta do something. And I looked at her and I said, if I told you that the only reason why the Orange Unified recall is going forward and why the Temecula signature gathering has been successful is because of money and resources provided by CTA. It's not the type of thing that I'm going to do an EdSource piece on. It's not the type of thing that you're going to hold a press conference on. But the only reason why they made it, and it's going to be on the March 5th ballot, Joe Boyd, the executive director of CTA, kicked in money for paid signature gatherers. And a sidebar on this, I consider myself a political junkie. I was aware that the law had changed with regard to recalls following the unsuccessful recall of Governor Newsom. I naively thought that they were changing things with regard to gubernatorial recalls. They changed things with regard to recalls at every level. So the threshold for signatures, anyway, it's higher. And like everybody, there's a push on, now that this has happened, how can we use recall? And most of the time, you're not going to get there without paid signature gatherers. So superintendents have to think about, really, when it comes to the future of public education, who are your real allies? Who can you count on to stand in the well and say, we're going to fight for the survival of public education? Because as we all know, where this is going is ultimately to create so much confusion, so much trouble in traditional public ed that some sort of a choice voucher initiative will be embraced. That's the end game of a lot of this. We had this unbelievable CSBA session, that type of thing, where we had some scholars talking about all this. But what's interesting, and I stayed after and talked to some of the more conservative school board members. What's interesting is this belief that if you have the largest congregation in the area, you are entitled to control the public school system. So I stayed after and I talked to some of these people, and they're absolutely on board with this. And then I gave them an example which created a bit of cognitive dissonance. And I said, are you saying that my good friend, Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles, he has the most parishioners than anybody else? Should Archbishop Gomez control LA Unified? They kind of, there's this, right, history of Catholics paying attention to some guy in another country, that sort of thing. So they're like, Not sure, actually, about that. But when it comes to Temecula, when it comes to Chino, and we're the largest congregation, whether it's the 412 in Temecula or Calvary Chapel in Chino, it's ours. We own it. The other thing I'm working on, historically, superintendents have stayed neutral with regard to school board elections, that type of thing. And I've called out myself and Chris Steinhauser, my successor in Long Beach. We endorsed candidates for the school board. And the bottom line, we weren't about to let anybody off the street come in and change what we were doing in Long Beach. And whenever I did that, I got an editorial from the local newspaper. Carl Cohn is trying to pick his bosses. My response was, if nobody gets to pick their bosses, I'll live with that. But don't tell me, as someone who actually knows something about school boards and actually has 2 kids in the school system, that I have to be completely silent. I acknowledge it's a tricky issue, and there's some places where you're definitely probably not gonna get away with that. But what Chris Steinhauser and I did has created 30 years of leadership stability in a large urban district. No other district in the country can point to that sort of thing. So I think as we're thinking about this, it's really important to figure out where to go next, what these new challenges are, and how we can retain good superintendents who are doing the right thing. And 2 places that I follow closely, Temecula on the one hand, Chino Valley on the other. The one superintendent in Temecula Valley, as they're wreaking havoc, you could see that her ethical and moral principles ultimately weren't going to allow her to continue. The other place, I don't know. We'll see.
Hey everybody, I'm so sorry that I can't be there. I blame the winter and I blame my decision to live on the East Coast. It is, but I'm so thrilled that I can talk to you a little bit today. And Julie, thank you for the introduction, assuming that is maybe what just happened. I'll get right into it. I know we're here to talk about how to navigate our way forward in public education and the challenges that have come from the pandemic. We all know what they are. Academic outcomes have suffered. Students and adults are struggling with their mental and physical health. Many of them are telling us that they've had enough, as evidenced by enrollment declines and staffing shortages. And to make matters worse, it's increasingly difficult to navigate all of it because basic concepts in our field, like what ought to be taught in schools, who belongs in our schools, is at the center of the political fray. And many of our leaders are losing their jobs as a result. There are a lot of perspectives that we considered my taking in this presentation, but I've decided to focus in on the insight that I've gleaned through my work with the Public Education Leadership Project at Harvard, which I co-chair with my partner, John Kim. So let me start by saying a little bit about the project for those who may not be familiar with PELP. PELP has been around for 20 years. It's a partnership between the School of Education and the Harvard Business School. That the program supports teams of executive level leaders in large urban districts with their most pressing problems. The project has multiple prongs. We engage leaders in an intensive summer institute, drawing on expertise from the business school, the Kennedy School of Government and the Ed School, this is probably what we're most known for. We write teaching cases to help explore excellence in leadership and management. These are cross-sector cases. And we codify what we think we're learning, both through our summer institutes and our engagement in the field, in research notes, like the note on racial equity in school systems, which I think was included in your materials for today. Those involved in PELP at the very beginning could see that excellence was hard to achieve at scale, in part because there were a lot of forces working against progress. They could see that there was disagreement on the purpose of public education, and therefore varying definitions of success. Political entities were taking advantage of that lack of clarity and pushing competing strategies. And funding streams were unpredictable, constrained, and of course, there was a lot of leadership turnover in the field. All those dynamics and more they could see were creating a lack of coherence in school district strategy. Think of the initiative upon initiative, the reorg upon reorg, the starts and stops. You get the idea, not much has changed. In just the past 5 years since I've started working with the project, we've had the pleasure of working with teams in California and across the country, but specifically Sacramento, Fresno, Long Beach, and LA have come to work with us in our Summer Institute. The kinds of problems that teams bring to PELP haven't changed much over the years. This I want you to know. In fact, we had a grad student recently analyze the problems of practice teams came with. Of course, those problems of practice were refined because of the work that they did with us. But this is the list of sample problems of practice just from this last year's cohort. There's nothing really new here. What has probably changed is the way that school districts and we at PELP are thinking about them. And that's where I wanted to kind of place my emphasis today. The PELP coherence framework, which serves as like the central framework for the project, was developed to serve as a tool for regularly diagnosing the coherence of school district work, given that in public education, there would inevitably be all kinds of pressures. In some ways, I think it's pretty simple and elegant. I generally start at the center. The framework demands, first and foremost, that any improvement strategy is tethered to the technical core of one's work. In other words, if it doesn't help teaching and learning about content worth learning, we shouldn't be prioritizing it. The framework also suggests that we make explicit our theories for making change that impacts the technical core of our work. That requires both defining success accurately and actually defining success and accurately identifying the problems that stand in the way of success as we've defined it. The idea is to bring to light the theory so that you can interrogate it. And also, I want to emphasize that having a theory isn't as important as the grappling with it, because the whole idea is to surface assumptions and mental models about how to make change. Your strategy, which is the thing that educators love to talk about, puts the theory into motion. It ought to be multi-pronged and synergistic, drawing on multiple aspects of the organization while being responsive to the environment, which offers both opportunities and constraints. And the environment is probably what you all are maybe most interested in. Because the environment, right, the rules and regulations, the funding, the politics, because that is always shifting for educators, coherence building never ends. In other words, district leaders are always visioning, they're always theorizing, they're always strategizing, they're always honing their strategy in response to this changing environment. So this is what has changed, right? This is the framework we've been using for about 20 years now. What we've learned is that this kind of strategizing, while powerful, is if it's not done with an equity lens, we risk coming up with the same old problem statements, right? Even after root cause analysis, the same solutions, and simply reproduce the same disparate outcomes. The note on racial equity in school systems, which I referenced earlier, it was meant to serve as a supplement to the coherence framework, and it highlights what we mean by developing a coherent strategy, but with an equity lens. And I just want to demonstrate that in a few different ways. For example, we suggest that it starts with developing with one's community a much more robust vision of excellence, a shared vision of excellence. I promise you, the vision that our parents, students, and teachers of color have for their own success is much more robust than the one that those in power have traditionally and historically set for them. This kind of vision can only be developed locally. The the graduate visions that have emerged in places like San Francisco, for example, I think have the potential to anchor our work in something more meaningful for our communities. Relatedly, we suggest that our measures of success have to better match those desires, that more robust vision. In education, that means moving beyond test scores and incorporating equally important measures of things like access to opportunity, student sense of belonging. I have always thought that it was important to develop metrics that intentionally counterbalance one another to make sure we don't get overly focused on any one measurement. We also suggest that leaders become more discerning about big new initiatives, right, which sometimes are driven from the outside. They're all there are many different ways that big new initiatives kind of come into fashion. But the real work is often the long-term slog of centering equity in everything we do. And Carl has often called this work a long-term slog. It is. It means embedding it in our systems and structures. That includes our HR systems, our decision-making structures, and our ways of engaging our community, in our decisions about resource allocation, and in our culture, right? The day-to-day ways of working, including the way we talk about our work. And in addition to trying to embed equity in everything we do, we have to do more than simply navigate the shifting environment, right? Which is what we've taught for so many years. But we need to learn more about how to influence it. So many of our leaders don't know enough, for example, about how government relations work, public relations, and advocacy. I think the thing that we're learning in part is that we need a new kind of more expansive set of knowledge and skills. We still need the typical skills that we've taught, all the things that we do on the left-hand side, right? Problem identification, theory and related strategy development, continuous improvement practices. These are all extremely important, but we also need a new set of skills focused on visioning with one's community, political mapping and movement building, partnership building, communication, advocacy, and policy interpretation implementation, which is some of the stuff that I've been working on with Carl through our collaborative on political leadership in the superintendency, and I hope he'll talk a little bit about that. So what are the implications for policy? I think this is what we're here to talk about. And I don't know what all the specific policy implications are. I wish I were there to have that conversation with you, but I will share a few kind of big ideas. The first is that improvement work requires stability. So I would look at any potential policy decision with that lens, whether it's taking a fresh look at superintendent contracts, election cycles, negotiation cycles, curriculum cycles, budget cycles. They need to be designed in a way that promotes as much stability as we can afford. Second, dramatic improvement will require community partnerships. That's because we can't do it alone. I do believe that school districts need local control to make nimble decisions, and it must be seen as a community effort. That means, stronger partnership and engagement with the city, with the county, with the union, with local nonprofits, potentially with other school districts, depending on how you're situated. But superintendents are civic leaders, after all, responsible for not just the performance of the school district, but the health of their community alongside other community leaders. And finally, we need to support the creation of more, I think, productive partnerships between parents and school districts, with more use of models like community schools, where parents have a real say in school and related community matters beyond the success of their own child, and in a way that is structured, the more productive I think these partnerships will be. I think these are powerful models that we should invest more in. I hope that gets the juices flowing. I'm really sad again that I can't be there to engage in the conversation. I'm sure that Julie, Carl, and Rachel will not only do a spectacular job, but they'll bring me up to speed. Thank you for being here, everybody, and thank you for your commitment to public education.
Hi, everyone. So I think this is such a great transition because I think so much of what both Carl and Jennifer talked about leads into a lot of the work that I've been doing, just really trying to better understand the work of the superintendency. I launched last August the Superintendent Lab. So I'm a former school board member, school board vice president, and a former policy analyst for the Michigan Association of School Administrators. So most of my life I've been interacting with superintendents. I've hired superintendents, I've evaluated superintendents, and I've watched them navigate really politically contentious situations, both locally and at the state level. And honestly, my dad joined the school board when I was 1 year old, and he still is on the school board. And so I had many conversations with this superintendents just growing up. It's always just been part of my life. And when I came into academia, I just felt like there wasn't a lot happening, and that people were really dismissing the power of the superintendency and the levers that they have to pull, particularly around policy, to see vision through. And so at the Superintendent Lab, what I really try to do is focus on sort of three pillars. One, this pillar of stability in the superintendency. So as both Carl and Jennifer talked about, it takes time to build relationships and trust and understand the needs of a community. And so when we're talking about how do we navigate politics, if there's not a lot of stability, superintendents are having to get to know new communities every couple of years, and communities are having to get to know them. And that can make things really challenging to healthy and equitable education systems. At the lab, we also focus on superintendent diversity with the belief that we need to have a diverse superintendency in order to make policy decisions for an increasingly diverse student population. And that superintendents are among the most visible figures in most communities, and a lack of diversity in these positions can convey values that are not favorable to inclusivity and diversity. And then third is thinking about working conditions. And so what are effective leadership strategies and workplace environments that support retention of high quality and diverse superintendents? So today I just want to share a little bit with you that mostly focuses on the stability side of things. In your materials, you did get a link to an infographic about U.S. superintendent attrition across the United States. And so let me just pause for a second and say, and as Julie mentioned, in 2019, I promised the Spencer Foundation that I'd do a national survey of superintendents, thinking that I could just go to the U.S. Department of Education and download a spreadsheet with every superintendent's name in it, and I realized that actually did not exist. So I created it in 2019, going state by state, and in most cases district by district, because even if a state had some sort of directory, it was never really very clear the last time the directory was updated. Sometimes it was in a PDF, which wasn't super helpful. And so I went district by district and collected about 12,500 superintendents' names. And from there, as I was doing that, I noticed that like every other superintendent was named Michael or Mark or Stephen. And so I decided that I was going to write this little paper on gender gaps in the superintendency, and I did that and learned that like one out of every five superintendents had one out of every five superintendents had one of five names actually, and they were all male names. And so and people were like, wow, like you have this data, and so I said I'm going to keep doing this because I think it's important. So we just finished the 5th year of data collection, so we now have 5 years of data on every superintendent in every district, and we can start to do cool things, like look at things like mobility and attrition, variation across those things based on gender. So this is where this data is coming from. But I shared with you an infographic that has some really concerning trends around superintendent attrition. So this is just a really basic one. Looking at California's superintendent attrition rates versus the national rates, and California has higher rates over the last 3 years than nationally. The year of the pandemic, the main year that we saw a lot of attrition was 2021-22, where it was over one out of every 5 superintendents in California left. If we pool this over all of the years at a national level, 37 states, so 3/4 of states have had more than half of their districts experience at least one superintendent turnover event since 2019. This is not a universal phenomenon. Rural areas have increased their superintendent attrition rates from 14% in 2019 to 18% this year. Cities increased from 15% to 20%. But the town and suburban locations aren't seeing as much increase. And then districts with larger proportions of students of color are significantly more likely to have experienced multiple turnover events since 2019. So a lot of districts have experienced one. Some districts have experienced more than one in just 4 years, and they tend to be in places with larger populations of students of color. And then just one last thing I'll just mention is between last year and this year, attrition rates at the state level were greater than 20% in 14 states across the nation. So there's lots more information on that little infographic that I sent out to you. But for the remainder of this, I want to dig into something new-ish that we've been doing at the lab. So beyond, one of the things that was really frustrating, and because I worked with superintendents, I knew that there's every superintendent in my data set is a person that has feelings and emotions and a family and loved ones. And the way that we talk about attrition sometimes feels really unhuman. And so I wanted to sort of humanize a little bit, to some extent, attrition and try to better understand it's not just that a superintendent chooses to stay or go, right? Something happens, and that's what causes them to stay or leave. And so every time that a superintendent leaves in our data set, and I have 5 amazing undergraduate researchers and 2 graduate students that work in the lab with me, and we code every piece of publicly available information that we can anytime a superintendent turns over to try to better understand what does the nature of this attrition actually look like. The easier parts are coding for things like, did they resign, did they retire? We code whether that or not they moved up to, say, a state level position or a regional position, whether they moved back down to an assistant sup position or a teaching position, or we code whether they move out, right? So did they move out and now they're the executive director of the State Association of School Administrators? Did they move out and work at a private school or a charter school? So we code for those things, and those tend to be pretty cut and dry because they're stated directly in the news articles. And then we also code more sentiment of the turnover. And so right now we have 2 codes. One is that it's ostensibly amicable, that it seems like everything was okay. They were just moving, to be closer to family, or they were moving for a better opportunity. Or amongst all the newspapers that were coding, did there seem to be some sort of political contention happening? That doesn't mean that the superintendent caused it, right? But it was, did the attrition happen in a politically contentious environment? And so there's lots of limitations to this, but it's a sort of first pass at trying to really better understand what attrition looks like. And so I want to share a couple of visuals with you all, I think. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so this one here, it's not very big, but you can kind of get the gist. Okay, so red is the national trend and blue is your California trend. So one of the things that sticks out to me here is that the proportion that are resigning is going up. The portion that's retiring is going down. And we can have a conversation about why we think that is. And then, as you can see on the blue line too, the proportion this past year of California superintendents that were fired or non-renewed, or their contract was left to be expired, was at 10%. A second thing that I will show you is the amicable versus contentious. Also, I'll just note, we don't force these categories onto data. So if in the newspaper article there's not enough data, we code it as not enough data. So you can see that actually this past year there was a big increase in the proportion in California where we could not find enough data. I will just note a lot of times this is more common with women superintendents who are trying to protect themselves in many ways, both professionally and personally. But regardless of the ones that there isn't enough data, if we just look at the amicable versus contentious or political, we are seeing a general increase in the contentious or political turnover. And California tends to be higher than the national average as well. And then this isn't something that is felt universally across all superintendents. So in this case, this is in California only, looking at men and women. And we can see the red line is the women line, that women superintendents in California are significantly more likely to be, in this past year, to experience contentious or attrition in a contentious or political environment compared to men in California. And then if we want to look sort of at, oh no, okay, here we go. Mobility trends. So this map here, we can zoom in and look at specific states, but essentially this is looking over time. A white dot is just folks that stayed. Anyone who's a green dot or a red dot are folks that are moving. And then if you're green, then it means that it was an amicable move. If you're red, it means it was a contentious or political situation that contributed to that movement. So, and this is looking at folks over time. This map is really hard unless you're really trying to zoom in on places. So I zoom it out and do this sort of heat map. So you can kind of get a better sense of where some of the clusters of political contention that lead to turnover are happening. And so even this one's a little hard. But you can see sort of, you can't really see, the lighting's not really great either. But Florida tends to be a place where there's a lot of political contention and superintendent turnover. I'll note that some Florida superintendents are elected as well. And so if you're an elected superintendent and you run for re-election and you don't get it, we code that as contentious and that you were fired. So it seems logical. But we can see here, since this is California, that there are some sort of pockets over time of where the red clusters happen to be, kind of right here. And if you sort of close down in the bottom, you all can't see can you see that? No, you can't. Oh, you can see that, okay. So this has been helpful. I'm a visual learner, and so this has been really helpful for me to kind of like sit back and just look and try to understand where are these things happening, and now that we have this data, what other types of data can we connect to this data set to really try to better understand superintendent attrition and the extent to which there's these connections between attrition and politics. And so why do I think this matters for addressing challenges in post-pandemic district leadership? One, just going back to the beginning, thinking about this increasing churn. And when there's increasing churn, then there's a constant getting to know the needs and developing trust with your community. But part of my research also looks at superintendent engagement with state education policymakers and with school board members. And every time that you get to a new district, you probably have a new state senator, a new state representative that you have to get to know and foster that relationship with them. And so when there's this increasing churn, you're spending more time doing those things, right? Which are really, really important. But you have to sort of start over every single time. And then two, there's sort of an increasingly contentious churn, right? And so I'm a mixed methodologist by training, so I do all of the quant work to kind of tell me, okay, now when I dig in qualitatively with superintendents, what do we need to talk about? And so in some of the qualitative work that I've been doing, talking with superintendents about how they make decisions in increasingly politically contentious environments, there's really, it has had sort of this quieting effect in terms of leading for equity and taking risks. They're all humans too that need a paycheck and they need health care and they need to support themselves and anyone else that relies on them. And so taking risks can be really hard sometimes. And when there is this increasingly contentious churn, it can be challenging to both speak up and speak out when it may be your job on the line. And then lastly, I'll just wrap up and say, my work is sort of focused on policy engagement, gender inequities, and attrition. And I would say over the last 3 months, all of these things have just sort of woven themselves together, in that we can't talk about how to engage in policy and advocacy conversations without recognizing that there are gender inequities in the way that I show up in a state legislator's office. The way I get treated when I walk into his office looks very different than the way that the director of policy at MASA, who was a man, got treated when he walked in his office. And so when we're talking about how do we lead in this political environment, we can't ignore the fact that we all can't approach this the same way. And we can say the same exact thing for race, and particularly for race and gender intersectionalities and other identity groups. So I'll just end there.
Carl, so
Phil,
So, full disclosure, Carl and I spent a lot of time in dark conference rooms working on San Francisco Unified's governance, right? Which Carl was instrumental in giving the advice about how to turn around, which we actually have turned around, right? I mean, you're not reading about SFUSD's governance anymore, and that's in part thanks to you. I would argue the opposite of what you argued, so this is why I'm trying to be provocative. All this attention across the state, across the nation, of what school boards do and the role they play and how they can screw things up, I would argue that the average citizenry, right, not that your average citizenry isn't sitting in the church pews, but the demographics would say that they're not, with the exception of places like Temecula and Orange. I can totally buy that, and Rockland's a mess, right? But along the mean, in school districts across the state, can it also be argued that people have now woken up and say, oh my Lord, school district board elections matter, and I'm actually now going to pay attention to it? And is it also possible that a different caliber or different disposition kind of person down the
I think we're going to find out this year, and pretty soon. If the Orange Unified recall on March 5th is unsuccessful, the message will go statewide to every evangelical church. Look, they tried to get rid of us. It didn't happen. And what this shows, how it will be interpreted, is this forced outing, all of this stuff. This is what real parents want. And so there's a lot riding, especially on this very first recall on March 5th. So I'm cautiously optimistic Why? Because the Orange Unified recall isn't 100% driven by a single church as opposed to Temecula and Chino. The church in Temecula, when it was announced by the Riverside County Registrar that there were enough signatures to recall the board president, that obviously totally fired up the church. And so they are going to pull out all stops. The interesting thing about this pastor, Tim Thompson, who declared the public schools the devil's playground, people have raised the issue of IRS status as a charity. He is the type of guy who stands in the well and says, I would like nothing more than a public fight with the IRS. I dare them to come after me. That's the kind of atmosphere that we're in. And I'm uncertain about the outcome, Phil.
I mean, I think we're still having lots of problems with filling school board. I mean, a lot of these races are still uncontested. So to your point, like, have people woken up? I'm not sure. I still think we're not getting enough people showing up and wanting to run for these positions. So not everywhere's Temecula, but I still think we have a ton of problems with school boards. And the politics are often personal politics too, right? So it's not the big Temeculas, but it's something in the community. And there are recalls that are going on all the time that are not about the kind of high level. Questions, other questions? I'm sorry, I'm moving things along because I want to make sure if anyone had questions. Any big ideas? So for me, the themes that came out, and I wanted to ask this of the panelists, that this notion of stability was in all three of the presentations, and the problems with the churn, which I think you showed really nicely. So what more can we do to be building that stability? I'm asking both of you. What are some promising? Again, we wanted to leave here not thinking about just all of the challenges facing our school leaders, but what can we be thinking about, whether it's at the local or state level, around this issue of retention, stability? What more?
I mean, a couple of things I've been thinking about I don't think that we can talk about this without thinking about, is this sort of a new reality? And like, the people becoming superintendents are eventually gonna, Gen Z, I don't know, right? But it's a more mobile generation. And so it's not necessarily about, well, we do need to talk about stability, but also what can districts do to stand themselves up to be stable as superintendents transition through that position, if this is just going to kind of be a new norm, because we know in the workforce that people just aren't staying places as long. And especially one of the primary, draws to education is used to be state pension systems, right? And as those are sort of faltering, I think we may see even more movement, right, across state borders and things like that, because it's not so much, I need to vest, I need to stay in this place for this many years to get my pension. So I think we have to think about all of those things when we think about stability. But I did a national survey of superintendents and then followed it up with about 40 interviews of superintendents. And some of the things that are coming out of that is just sort of, it's not earth-shattering, but just micromanagement of them by school boards. So I think there's a lot of work that school boards and school board members need to do. They need a lot of introspective work that needs to happen.
If you just silent, it's gonna touch the button.
A lot of introspective work that needs to happen. A lot of thinking about the biases and discrimination that they may bring to some of their decisions. I was just talking with Fox 5 News in DC, and Montgomery County Public Schools superintendent is a black woman, and they just told her that she needed to resign without cause. And so I think there's entirely race and gender issues that school boards need to reckon with. School boards tend to be the most diverse publicly elected body, but it's still really sad to see how undiverse, non-diverse they are. So I think we also need to think about how do we provide access to school boards for more diverse candidates, and then how do we work with school boards to treat superintendents better.
Carl, did you want to add?
Can you hear me? So everybody watched, and this is still one of the issues in the Orange Unified Recall. Gunn-Marie Hansen, popular superintendent, school district was on winter break, not this past year, but a year ago. She's flying back from Oslo, Norway, after dealing with her ailing mom. Oslo to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Minneapolis, Minneapolis to LAX. She is being fired by the school board at an emergency meeting. The state, Senator Josh Newman, actually did something about that, wrote a bill that requires superintendents to be dismissed only at a regularly scheduled school board meeting, not at a meeting that's established 24 hours before. And it's fascinating to watch this year. So Governor Newsom signed the bill, went into effect on January 1. On December 28th, in Keppel Union High School District in the High Desert, they fired their school board meeting, their school board, their superintendent at an emergency meeting with 24 hours notice, 3 days effectively before the new law went into effect. That's sort of a minor change, but I think we have to think about what are those other things that would make stability in the right direction a good thing. And I came across this during the pandemic. One of the things that people wouldn't readily know, I had done 2 4-year terms in Long Beach, and I wanted to leave. There was a job waiting for me at USC. And the school board said, we want you to stay 10 years, not 8. So here's what we're going to do. Take your family, go anywhere in the world. We're going to give you a summer sabbatical. You get renewed, recharged. So I took the sabbatical. We went to Australia and Fiji for the summer, came back and actually did some of the best work in Long Beach for the final 2 years, starting with getting 72% approval on a major bond initiative and all those other things ultimately that Long Beach became known for, like winning the Broad Prize. That was a part of those final 2 years. And so I think we need to think about what the reward structure is and more things that we can do to keep people who are having a good run.
And in addition to thinking about reward structures, and that's really important, we were, in Jenna's slides, there was the new skill set that she thought we all needed, and I heard people talking about that at their tables. So how can we work on developing that skill set? And I think our table in the back that I sat in had some really interesting ideas about how do we formalize networks that are now informal for superintendents, and then how do we think about building, there was a really nice idea in the back about pathways. We talk about pathways to the principalship. What about pathways to the superintendency and ways in which we can start building the political skills and that other sort of new set of skills that Jen outlined? I'm going to pose that to the two of you. Any thoughts on how we work on that skill set and the capacity building? In 1 minute time, Carl.
Yeah, my bias is I think politics is incredibly important, and we need to go ahead and embrace that reality in our preparation, training, and support programs, and sometimes we shy away from it. I still hear people saying things like, you know, so-and-so was being political. When I was a first-year superintendent, we went to Harvard for something. They took us on a field trip to the John F. Kennedy Library in Cambridge. When you walk up the steps at that library, up on the masthead, it says, dedicated to the memory of the 35th President of the United States and all those who through the art of politics seek a new and better world. Shouldn't superintendents who are charged with creating a better world for youngsters, shouldn't they be the best practitioners of politics? I'm arguing that they should be.
Any thoughts, Rachel, to add to that on how we do that? So let's assume that we agree that politics are part of the job.
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who's a professor in an institution of higher education, we have to be better. I think we're teaching, there's a lot of skills that we're trying to teach aspiring superintendents, but this has to be at the center of them. And states need to require this type of training for leaders. And in the state of Tennessee, where I'm at, you can have I think you can have an associate's degree and be a superintendent. There's no requirement that you need to have any sort of higher education. And not that, right, like it has to be something super, like a PhD, but I think we do need to require, the development of these skill sets, but also the practice and the mentorship and the networking and some of the research that I did on barriers to superintendent engagement in politics. One of the big things is that the only way they learn how to do it is trial by error, and I think that's a shame. So I think developing these support networks, Carl working with other superintendents to pass this on, those types of things are going to be really important.
Yeah, of course, there's trade-offs, because if we require more of them and we're already struggling to get people into this position, we have to work on that sort of tension. All right, we're out of time. I want to thank the panelists.